We're here to talk about a takedown of a violent street gang that was selling drugs, but they were also responsible for many acts of violence here in Brooklyn, including 2 homicides and 7 non-fatal shootings. We're charging them variously with conspiracy to commit many other crimes, and we've also recovered 6 firearms during this long-term investigation. Now, I want to be clear. In the past, we've had different types of cases with loose street gangs, mostly young men who grew up on the same block or in the same housing development, form friendships and run together and commit crime together. This is a little bit different. This is sort of an old-style 90s gang. It's very hierarchical. There's people in charge of this gang. They have rules. They have an oath that they have to take. They have a constitution. They have their own coded language that they use to speak to each other and also to be able to identify who's actually a member of that gang. And this gang calls themselves the Brick Squad. Now, they're really part of a larger criminal organization. They call them caves. They're part of a cage called the Untouchable Gorilla Stone Nation, which is part of the Bloods Nation. So this is a bona fide gang. These are not just young men who hang together and get in trouble together. This is a organized group. And so what I'd like to do is show you some of the rules that this governs this gang. Looking over here, you can see the Untouchable Gorilla Stone Nation rules. This was actually recovered as part of this long-term investigation. There are a lot of rules. Never let the enemy of Rilla live around you, since they call themselves part of Gorilla Stone Nation. Rilla is an abbreviation of that. Crush our enemies on sight. Never talk about a Rilla to an outsider, which is also part of Do Not Snitch, and so forth. You can see these and they'll be made available to you. Breaking these rules carries severe consequences, from getting beat up to actually getting killed. And as I mentioned, they also had a unique language, a coded language that they refer to as ape music. You can see here a snippet of this glossary. I think what's important in terms of this case is that they have names for drugs, contraband. So home invasion is dope or heroin. A-Rod is cocaine. There are terms for locations, different parts of the city, and have different names, code names for them. For family members, they have codes for different days of the week. They have codes for different gangs that they confront. So this glossary was also recovered as part of our long-term investigation. As you see, it's handwritten. They're expected to memorize this. This is how they identify that someone is actually a member of the gang. They have to be able to speak this coded language. If they don't memorize it, there's severe consequences for them. So this is what this gang, and it just allows them to communicate fairly openly and talk about criminal activity without people really being able to understand them. I'm going to talk about the defendants who are part of this case. You're going to see that some of them, well, okay, so this is what I'm going to say is from our investigation, seems to be the leader of this gang. He's a 49-year-old man. He's been in prison for quite some time. His name is Howard Smith. His nickname is Hamo. He also goes by the Godfather. He's currently serving a life sentence, and we allege that he is the leader of this Brick Squad gang. He is definitely an integral part of this conspiracy, although he's in prison. When we were investigating this case, one of the things we learned is that he has more than $25,000 in his commissary. We allege that money is part of drug money. It's how the lower members of the gang pay tribute to him, and they continue to fund that commissary. Now, that doesn't seem to be enough for him, because as we became involved in investigating his activities, we learned that he was often complaining that people weren't putting enough money in his commissary and wasn't visiting him enough. Let's play one of the calls that we intercepted.
Most of these dudes are not really putting nothing in. They're not even putting no work in, especially behind the wall. Yo, bro, that's all. Yo, bro, I'm the fucking godfather, right? I'm the fucking godfather. I don't take care of shit. You take care of me. What godfather you ever met? That he takes care of. Think about it. Does it make sense? Or am I the fool?
You doesn't make sense. Not listening to that. I say you definitely right.
Yo, these motherfuckers got a motherfucker supposed to baby them. I'm telling this motherfucker, Tiffy, I'm trying to get out the box. He wants me to write, he wants to be on the same page with me, right? Which is fine. I'm telling him, listen, when I get the information, we're gonna put this thing together. You gotta have patience.
So you've been introduced to what we believe is the leader of this Brick Squad gang. I want to turn to some of the other members of the group who we are part of this indictment. This is a little bit of a hierarchy. You've heard of Forbes 100 or the Forbes 500. They actually have a document called the Forbes list. That actually is a list that promotes and demotes people within the gang. And this is one of the Forbes lists that we come to. The top of the list is a guy right there at the very top. His name is Marco Pender. He's also in prison currently. And anyone you see with a red border around their image was in prison during different parts of the investigation. He's doing time for manslaughter in prison, and he also has a fairly large commissary. He has over $12,500 in his commissary and gets frequent inputs from fellow gang members into that commissary. He is the day-to-day direct operator of the gang, and that's our allegations. We also are charging him in directing one of the homicides that are part of this case. So that is the one of the day-to-day leaders of the gang. There are other high-ranking members. One of the mid-ranking members is the guy to the right of the screen, Stephen Cadu. Right under Stephen Cadu, there are three other men. Those men work for Stephen Cadu. They're his grand hustles. They work for him and do much of the work that he needs done, which is selling drugs and doing other things. But that's Washington, Marquise, and Farmer, and they work directly under Cadu's direction. They're expected to sell drugs not only here in Brooklyn, but as this investigation was continuing, we realized that they were also going upstate New York to Binghamton, New York, and surprisingly, they were going to Maine, to a town, Bangor, Maine, where they would also sell drugs. Now, the reason that we believe they were going to Binghamton in Maine was because they would get a lot more money for their drugs than they could get here in Brooklyn. And so they would fairly routinely, weekly, make trips up to upstate or to Maine to sell their drugs. This gang, again, is a typical gang in the sense that they have to exercise dominance over their territory. And so a lot of that, the violence surrounding this gang also involved dominance, exercising over territory. But there was also a lot of violence in terms of enforcing the rules of their gang among fellow Brick Squad members. The first murder charge in this indictment took place in December of 2017, and the victim was a young man named John Fernandez, who was a member of Brick Squad. You're going to be able to see him in a moment in the video. He's hanging out with Deshaun Washington, who was on the bottom screen. They're smoking marijuana together, and they're coming back from Maine, where they had just allegedly sold drugs. Can we play the video?
Hey, yo.
So this video shows two members of the Brick Squad hanging out together. They had a friendly relationship, and we believe, and we have charged Deshaun Washington for the murder of John Fernandez. But as the investigation continued, we also received communications between Christopher Garcia and Stefan Cadu discussing how Fernandez was not bringing in enough money, how he wasn't selling enough drugs, and that caused them to doubt whether or not he was being loyal to the gang. And in fact, they actually believed that he was cooperating with the police. So we allege that they ordered a hit from prison to have him killed, and that they had his friend Washington do that killing. That's how ruthless the gang is. We're going to see a video in a moment. It is grainy video. You're going to see two men. The man that you see walking towards the building, he's going to be walking towards one of the residents. That is John Fernandez. He's the decedent, the victim in that case. And you're going to see the second man, who we allege is Washington. And at one moment, you're going to see as Mr. Fernandez starts to walk towards this residence, defendant Washington raises his arm, his hand is pointed, and he is shot. Play the video. Raises his arm, and he's shot and falls down. That killing took place in Bedford-Stuyvesant on Bainbridge Street. When he was found later that morning, when Mr. Fernandez was found, he was wearing a ski mask that covered his face. He thought, we believe that he thought they were going to do a burglary, and that's how he was set up to bring him from where he lives over to Bedford-Stuyvesant, where he was shot. Now, what makes this really troubling is not only was he murdered, this was only hours after they were just hanging out together, smoking marijuana. This is just the same, it's the same day, just a few hours later. Now, we have another video of another fatal shooting, and that one took place in April of 2018. The victim in that case was a man named Claudel Gary. Claudel Gary and his brother and other members of the Gary family have had an ongoing beef and problems with this gang. And there had been a lot of violence between these folks in the past. There had been some shootings back and forth at each other, and we believe that at some point there was an order that came from Markel Pender, who was in prison, who ordered Stephen Cadu to finally settle this and to take care of and to kill Claudel Gary. We're going to show you a video in which right before the video, we believe Cadu handed a gun to one of his underlings, a guy named Queezer Farmer, or they call him Quasi. And the video will show you once Mr. Farmer has the gun in his hand, what happens. We're also going to see that the decedent, Claudel Gary, he's the person that's going to be on the left of the video. He's talking to another person. That person, we believe, is a member of the Brick Squad. They're just having a conversation. Possibly this was a setup, but you'll see what happens next. And I do caution, it's a little bit graphic, but this is exactly what's happening on this case. Please play the video. So it's just a cold-blooded execution. This was a previously unsolved homicide. We have now indicted Farmer, Cadu, and Pender for being responsible for this homicide. As I mentioned before, this is an old school gang, and they make their money from dealing drugs. Now they sell marijuana, they sell cocaine, they sell heroin. They unfortunately also sell heroin that's mixed with fentanyl. And as all of you know by now, fentanyl is a deadly drug. We're going to also play some conversations that we were able to uncover that talks about how they understand how fentanyl is killing people. You're going to hear Stephen Cadu and a man named Lee Kennedy talk about overdose deaths that had happened to 3 people up in Maine. And I'm going to remind you, you had a vocabulary quiz earlier where there was some things. So home invasion, if you remember, is short for dope or heroin. When they're talking quickly in their lingo, they'll shorten it to evasion. So home invasion just becomes evasion. A duffel bag are dead bodies, and carti is money. So knowing that again, that evasion is heroin, and duffel bags are dead people, and carti is money. Let's listen to the phone call that was uncovered.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know that vision that he 900 is bricks. That's what spooky. I ain't like
That shit, that vision we pulled with some them, it was like a duffel bag for people. That shit was duffeling 3.
Yeah, like I told you, bro. That shit
I was
was
a kid, bro.
Yeah, we had to stop. 900 and that shit where we was at. Cause shit started getting spooky like this. That's what was different. I was like, see, that's alone.
That should make me only when there's so much cardi out in vehicles. I ain't think that.
Gotta be on that vision ready though, cause that shit cardio there.
Yeah, the vision niggas retarded. I can't leave that one.
So what you're hearing is them talking about how scary all these deaths are in caused by the sale of heroin that's mixed with fentanyl, and that heroin is so popular, it's on the scene so much in Maine. And if you know a little bit about the overdose crisis, Maine has a very big problem with opioids there. They're saying it's just too much money to stop doing it, even though they know it's killing people. A complete and utter disregard for human life. This is all about the gang and making money in cash. And as you remember, John Fernandez was killed, we believe, because he wasn't selling enough of that heroin in Maine. So that's what this gang is about. They're about violence. They are about making money and selling dangerous drugs in our communities and elsewhere. No more after this case. With this arrest, we've 48 count indictment. We've indicted 10 people. Some of them were arraigned yesterday. Some of them will be arraigned today. Most of them have been remanded, and those who have gotten bail have received bail in terms of $500,000 or more. We're not going to allow these violent street enterprises to poison our communities. We're not going to allow them to deal these dangerous drugs. We're not going to allow them to shoot and kill other people in the street that they have beefs with, or kill themselves. And they put everyone in danger by their behavior. This is an extensive and long-term investigation, and it highlights a few things. It highlights the great working relationship that the New York City Police Department has with the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office and the Violence Suppression Unit in solving what had been previously unsolved shootings and homicides. The police department has done an incredible job in going back and investigating these cases. And this is very detailed-oriented work to go back, scrub social media, get the right phone recordings, getting the subpoenas and the warrants that it causes that you have to do this work. It's time-consuming, but it is the right strategy. It is the strategy that I support in enforcing, which is you have to focus on the violent drivers of crime. And it's clear from what you've just seen that these are the right men to focus our law enforcement energy against. I believe that this is a relatively small number of people that have done a lot of harm to communities, especially in Brownsville, East New York, Bed-Stuy, and up here in northern Brooklyn. And we are going to see a betterment of our communities in terms of safety, and in terms of health, because these men are now incapacitated and in prison. So I want to thank all of the people who worked on this case from the police department side. I also like to thank the assistant district attorneys and detective investigators from my office who worked on that, including Maria, James, and Janelle, and also Ray Tierney, who has oversaw our Violent Criminal Enterprises Bureau, and Al DeAngelis, who is the chief of the unit. Thank you all. And you're now going to hear from our chief of detectives.
Thank you, Mr. DA, and good morning to all. I want to acknowledge all the great work that's being done by the Gun Violence Suppression Division, led by Richard Green, Captain Tom Pasola, and Lieutenant Rich Zacharies. In 2019, this team has conducted 3 takedowns in Brooklyn, consisting of 30 of the most violent offenders involved in approximately 40 incidents of homicides and non-fatal shootings. This is the essence of precision policing, focusing on the most violent offenders, working with our federal, local, and state partners. I want to thank the Kings County District Attorney's Office for your continued partnership and assistance taking these individuals into justice. Now I'm going to pass it over to Inspector Richard Green to speak about yesterday's takedown of the Brick Squad gang members.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Inspector Richard Green from the Gun Violence Suppression Division. Thank you for letting me speak to you today, and the beauty about speaking after the Chief of Detectives and District Attorney Gonzalez is hopefully there's not too many stones uncovered. But what you saw today, and the beauty about coming here, is the presentation that the District Attorney puts together on these cases. It really gives you a feel for the audacity and egregiousness of the crimes that we get to investigate on a daily basis, and we take that very seriously. It's our honor to take on that type of investigation and put these harm doers behind bars so that the people of Brooklyn and every other borough that we serve as the Gun Violence Suppression Division and the Detective Bureau in general can share in that safety that you receive from this very arrest. So today I stand here to report the arrest of these 10 members of the Violent Bloods gang. They were committed, as was said, to the shootings and homicides and other acts of violence here in Brooklyn, specifically in Vinegar Hill, Bed-Stuyvesant, and Brownsville neighborhoods. This Bloods crew, as was previously mentioned, was known as the Brick Squad, and a subset of the untouchable guerrilla Stone Nation, and came to our attention, the Gun Violence Suppression Division, in the spring of '18, subsequent to a series of shootings and homicides which were carried out against rivals and non-compliant members of their own gang, which you saw today in the videos. These purported acts of violence were generally committed in crowded neighborhood streets. And again, that's the essence of what we're talking about here, the danger to the public. They established geographic dominance over other gangs and to create revenue for their crew. So this particular case, as Chief Harrison mentioned, it really embodied NYPD policy of precision policing. We allege that each one of these charged individuals were intimately involved in these most egregious acts of violence that this gang is responsible for. Like so many times before, we're pleased to have partnered with Kings County District Attorney's Office. DA Gonzalez has continuously supported the Gun Violence Suppression Division and helped create an enormous collaborative relationship between the investigators from my office and the members from the Violent Crime Enterprise Bureau. I'd like to personally recognize and thank ADA James Slattery, Bureau Chief Al DeGenis, and Deputy Bureau Chief John Sennett, who's like a partner to us, for their unwavering commitment and their hard work. And if I may introduce the members of the Gun Violence Suppression Team that are equally committed to every violent act they investigate here in Brooklyn and throughout the city. The commanding officer of Zone 1 couldn't be here today, unfortunately, is Captain Tom Pasola. And next is a guy that pours his blood, sweat, and tears into every single case, working nonstop through this holiday season to ensure a successful conclusion to this case and every other. And that's Lieutenant Zacharies, who's standing directly behind me. Sergeants Ed Deegan, Andy Dutton, and Calvin Fergus, whose leadership was unmatched and appreciated. And case detectives, Douglas Rome, Mike Algieri, Herb Martin from Brooklyn North Homicide, and Nick Sophocles, who puts a lot of this together on these videos that you're seeing, and so many of the others that work tirelessly through this holiday season and every non-holiday season, 365 days a year. Thank you very much.
All right, we'll take any on-topic questions. Yes.
The inspector just talked about the goal being to put these harm doers behind bars. But at least two of these guys were already behind bars while they're leading this enterprise. So I'm wondering, first of all, where was the Godfather imprisoned? And is there not some kind of a warning system when their commissary count goes up that can prevent this kind of enterprise from happening in the first place?
So it's a good question. It's something that we've been looking at, and there are currently no limits on how much money someone can put in their commissary, and that's something that I think will have to be referred to DOC to start thinking about. Are there red flags that could be, ascertained earlier? But it also is a good investigative lead to see who's putting this money into the commissaries, and so we are working towards that. In terms of leading from prison, that's what makes this case very troubling. It's in fact that two of the main members of this gang were already in jail for killings of them, that they had been convicted of killings themselves, and they're in prison and they're still leading this activity. And I think it speaks to how we need to monitor our folks that are in jail who are leading this. And now one of the things is, and without giving up any investigative techniques, those phone calls you heard from prison, or that we have, and we didn't play all of them, they have different ways of getting around security protocols in prison, and we've been figuring out how to capture those conversations. So we're doing a really good job working with our, the police department and corrections in order to figure out how do you prevent that moving forward. But it's a great question, and it is one of the most disturbing aspects of this case is that they're committing damage and they're harming our communities while they're still incarcerated. Yes, Noah?
Kind of related to that, are these 10 people who were arrested all of the Brick Squad? Are there still people out? So, because if the people were directing this kind of stuff from prison, are there other people who they could enlist, or do you think that everyone who is part of this gang is out?
So the simple answer is there are many more people out there who are part of the larger subset. Right? This is a one cave of the Guerrilla Nation Squad, which is a subset of the Bloods. There are other people out there. We're working to identify those folks and to hold them accountable for what they do. But we think that this Brick Squad being broken up the way it was will actually improve public safety in those communities that we talked about. So this is an important case.
Do you have some sort of sense of scale with these guys? How much they're moving, what kind of revenue they're pulling in, anything like that?
Without getting into, because as Noah had indicated, the question had indicated, there are still things that we're investigating, but this is a group that's probably selling hundreds of thousands of dollars of narcotics yearly, based on how frequent they travel to Maine and upstate and what they do here. We know that a single trip to Maine, they bring home, selling a very small amount of narcotics, 5,000, they just get a much higher price up there. So this is a profitable enterprise. Yes?
You said this is a long-term investigation. Can you talk about when the investigation started and what triggered it in the first place?
Well, I'll let the inspector talk about that, but we've been looking at this from, I guess, March of 17 to currently December of 19. Is there anything else? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. As I mentioned earlier, gun violence started our investigation around the spring of 2018. And to kind of speak on what the DA was just referring to, is we will go back and investigate during our investigative protocol prior acts of violence that we uncovered during these investigations. Okay, and again, to elaborate a little bit and discuss one of the other questions was precision policing. You know, what does that mean? Are these gangs bigger in scale? Absolutely. But gang life as a whole doesn't necessarily mean that you're the individuals that are selling the large amounts of drugs or pulling the trigger. So that's what we're going after. And we work with our partners in the Detective Bureau, other units, which speaks to why some are in jail. They'll conduct investigations at the same time that we do. And some of them wind up prosecuted in those investigations as we conduct our investigation into these heinous acts of violence. I hope that cleared up some of the questions.
Yes.
Where are they getting drugs from?
We're not going to answer that question now. I mean, we continue to investigate these cases. Yes.
Why is this a state case? Why is it not federal? A lot of stuff that could fit into the attorney statute here.
So it was a local investigation, and obviously the drug charges are federal, but this is they're facing homicide charges and conspiracy to commit homicide. Most of these individuals are looking at life sentences.
How are you guys proactively making sure that these suspects don't pop up? Because I know back in 2015, a suspect in the Bronx of the same gang was dismantled, and here we are in Brooklyn. Another suspect has popped up, and you guys have worked on that, but how are you guys proactively working on this?
Inspector, you want to talk about?
You know, intelligence is an active component in any of our investigations, and although it seems that those two groups are assimilated, they're not necessarily. Being under the Gorilla Stone umbrella doesn't mean that you grew up knowing each other. It means that sort of you work for the same corporation, if you understand now. So those individuals up in the Bronx may very well not have ever met these individuals down in Brooklyn, but we are an intelligence-driven unit. The Detective Bureau as a whole is an intelligence-driven unit, and that communication is seamless within the Detective Bureau Intelligence Division and Intelligence Division of the NYPD to thwart just an issue like you just brought up.
Yes, sir.
So with this takedown, this filling a void now, is it looking like possibly more officers could be over that area because this area is now to be potentially taken over by a rival gang or something else? Is that something we need to have, that they could probably do that?
Well, one of the things that the District Attorney's Office and the New York City Police Department and the Mayor of New York City is how do we prevent these voids from being filled in by other bad guys, and there are efforts underway to try to figure out how do you do that work, how do you prevent the next younger people from moving into that spot. It is something that's an ongoing challenge, but there is a lot of thinking around it. There's some new initiatives in terms of putting people out there in the streets who are trying to work on preventing that from happening. And let's be clear, the police department and my office will continue to make headway in driving down violence in the county, and including trying to incapacitate those who will try to pick up the mantle. It's our hope that we do other things to provide incentives for those young folks not to move into those roles, and there's different things that we work with the police department and some of our federal partners in trying to dissuade people from entering into that life. But it's an ongoing challenge.
If I could just touch on that, that's actually a very good question. And you know, one of the roles that we're going to look at going forward anytime we do a takedown is just making sure the community is aware of exactly what's going on, making sure that there's a engagement with the youth. This is what another philosophy that we have in place that's very instrumental is neighborhood policing, making sure the NCOs are plugged in with the great work that's being done by our gun violence suppression division, and making sure that everybody's aware of exactly what's going on, and make sure we get the youth in the right direction going in the future so they don't have to partake in some of these problematic crews that are plaguing the communities of Brooklyn.
Yes, sir.
Is there any indication or any way to know how many people their drugs may have killed?
We know.
And would there be charges that remain on those possibly?
Those questions are very viable. The narcotics portion of this, when we take down a violence or violence conspiracy case, it doesn't stop there. I think the DA was pretty clear in mentioning that. So some of the other units of our department will continue and work with partners out of state, work with our federal components even to deal with interstate trafficking. So because we're here today to announce the indictment of these 10, it doesn't stop there. And what you asked is part of that, of an active investigation right now. Thank you.
And I had a very brief phone call with the district attorney up in Maine, letting them know that there would be a case coming that they may be wanting to, investigate in their own way. So, yes.
For the defendants who are already serving life sentences, what steps will be taken to make sure that they won't just go back to doing this even at the same time?
Well, first of all, we know who they are, we know that they're doing it, and we understand the mechanism by how they were able to communicate much of these gang orders through how they bypass security protocols and corrections. We also actually now know their coded language. And so we actually now understand when they're giving orders that did not seem to make a lot of sense. If someone was listening, we also know how to understand and translate that and understand what that means. So I think we've come a long way. I'm not going to get into all the Department of Corrections protocols, but they actually have their own protocols to try to prevent them from leading gang activity from the inside. So there's work to be done there for sure, but I think having uncracked this code is a big step. They're not going to be able to talk with impunity on the telephones for sure.
When you're cracking that code, did you arrest somebody who was able to sort of clue you in on what they're saying, or did you find a list? How did you?
Yeah, we're not going to get into specifics. Like as we said, there are ongoing investigations, but this is a very structured organization with their own rules and codes and hierarchy, and we have a lot of insight to how this gang now operates. Take one more question. Yes, sir.
The prison conversations, was that during a visit or over a cell phone that someone slept to these men?
This is over regular phone calls that they're allowed to make, but they have they do different things. And like a very simple thing is using someone else's PIN number, so they're calling, and the phone call is registered to a different inmate. Those are like a simple thing that often is done. I think the coded language also plays an important role in allowing them to get away with saying things, because you wouldn't understand in general most of the stuff until you crack the vocabulary code there. So thank you all for coming.